Our story spans the 18th and 19th centuries in the isolated farmsteads of the Siberian wilderness. There, daily family life was shaped by the awareness that winter was not merely a season to endure, but a vast and patient predator, testing everything you knew, everything you had prepared, everything you dared hope would be enough. These settlers, pushed to the edge of the known world by circumstance or decree, found themselves in a landscape where the ground froze to stone by October and stayed that way until May, where forests stretched endlessly in every direction, where the nearest town might be a week's sled journey away through snow deep enough to swallow a horse. You wake in the grey light at early October, the air stinging your face the moment you rise from the rough blankets. The cold has come a few weeks earlier than last year, and you feel it in your chest, not a precise pain, but a tightness, a warning. Winter's skeletal fingers are already reaching for you. Your small dwelling, built of logs chinked with moss and mud, offers little comfort even before the true deep freeze. This single room is kitchen, workshop, bedroom, and storeroom. The walls are blackened by years of smoke from the clay stove crouched in the corner like a sullen beast. Outside, the view is turning stark and unforgiving. The birch trees that seemed bright and hopeful in summer now stand pale and skeletal against an iron-grey sky. The ground underfoot is beginning to harden, losing the softness of soil, taking on a near-stone-like quality. You step into the garden, if that's a generous enough word for the patch of earth you've wrested from the forest, and feel the frost crunch under your worn felt boots. The cabbages you've tended since spring sit in heavy rows, their outer leaves jeweled with ice crystals that catch the weak morning light. Each head represents weeks of work preparing the soil, hauling water from the stream, protecting the tender seedlings from late frosts that could strike even in June. Your hands, already rough from months of labor, ache dully as you bend to begin the harvest. The cold seeps through your wool, mittens mended under and ended, until the original fabric is almost invisible beneath the patches, making your fingers stiff and clumsy. You grasp the first cabbage firmly, give it a sharp twist, feel the satisfying snap as it breaks from the stem, shake off a clump of frozen earth, and set the heavy head aside. The work is methodical, repetitive, and endless. Each cabbage must be examined for rot, pest damage, any weakness that could cause it to spoil and storage and contaminate the others. One bad head missed in haste could ruin an entire barrel by spring. You move down the rows with a practiced, efficient rhythm, but your mind never stops calculating 12 cabbages so far, each about 4 or 5 pounds. Not as large as you'd hoped, but the summer was dry, and you could only haul so much water from the stream. At this rate, maybe 60 heads total. These must be allocated for daily eating, for fermenting into sauerkraut, and for storage in the root cellar. The sun, when it occasionally breaks through the thick cloud scarves, a low arc across the southern horizon. You've already noticed how each day it seems fainter than the last, how the angle of the light has shifted so that even at noon, the shadows stretch long and thin across the frozen ground. It is the light of a sun because abandoning you, withdrawing its warmth, leaving you to face what is coming alone. By mid-minus morning, your back begins to protest, a dull pain settling deep in your spine and radiating outward with each bend and twist. You straighten occasionally, pressing a hand into the small of your back, looking out over your small domain, the garden being slowly stripped of its bounty, the growing pile of harvested vegetables by the door, the forest looming, dark and indifferent to your struggle. The turnips fight you next. Their roots have dug deep into soil that is now more ice than earth, each one requiring loosening with a digging bar before it can be pulled. Your shoulders burn with the effort, a familiar twinge in your right wrist, a legacy of a fall to winters past that never truly healed. Some turnips come out clean and whole, firm purple minus white globes of promise. Some snack as you pull, half left frozen in the ground, useless now except perhaps for the few chickens you keep in the shed behind the house. You try not to think of how many potatoes were lost that way last year. How you and your husband sat in the February dark, rationing the dwindling supply, taking a little less with each meal than the body truly needed. The carrots are easier, at least. Their slender forms slide from the earth with less resistance, but must be brushed free of soil immediately. lest it freeze into an impenetrable armor. Your fingers are numb now despite the constant motion, and you work by feel as much as by sight, running your hands over each carrot, checking for soft spots, the telltale sign of rot starting within. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the sound of a neighbor's axe, a steady, rhythmic thwack that carries sharp and clear through the cold air. He is cutting firewood as you should be, as everyone should be, for there is never enough to feel truly secure against the months ahead. But the vegetables cannot wait, and so you make 100 such choices every day, each one a tiny wager against catastrophe. At noon, you allow yourself to stop, not because the work is done, but because your body demands it. You carry an armload of cabbages inside, depositing them on the rough wooden table that dominates the center of your home. The fire in the stove has burned low, and you feed it carefully with birch bark and small twigs. The larger logs are too precious to waste except in the truly dangerous deep night cold. You prepare a simple meal: black bread, hardened, made from rye flour mixed with ground bark to stretch the grain, a small piece of salted fish, pot in the summer and preserved in a heavy brine, so salty it makes your tongue pucker. Hot water steeped with a handful of dried herbs. You can't rightly call it tea, but it warms the hands that cradle the wooden cup, and that in itself is value. As you eat, you mentally tally what still needs to be done before the ground becomes utterly unworkable. The potatoes, maybe 300 pounds if you're lucky, waiting to be dug from a separate plot beyond the garden. Each one must be carefully forked up, checked for damage, sorted by size and condition. The largest, healthiest will be stored whole, the smaller or damaged must be eaten first, before their flaws become fatal. The beets, ruby minus red and sweet, need harvesting. The onions must be pulled and braided into strings, hung in the driest corner of the house where air can circulate around them. If you hurry, there are mushrooms yet to be gathered in the forest. The heady autumn bolts that can be dried will add precious flavor and substance to winter soups. And then there is the root cellar itself, the hole in the ground that represents your family's best hope of seeing spring. It needs inspecting, repairing, preparing. Last winter, you discovered too late that water had seeped in through a crack in the wooden lining, flooding the lowest shells and ruining 2 sacks of potatoes you were counting on to see you through March. You finish your meager meal and return outside, the afternoon light taking on the peculiar quality of these latitudes, bright but somehow cold, as if the sun itself has become a distant, indifferent spectator. The piles of harvested vegetables grow, but so does the list of tasks yet to be done. The potato plot is at the edge of the clearing, land you and your husband spent weeks stumping and stone minus clearing to claim 3 summers ago. Soil that seems determined to resist cultivation. Kneel in the frost and begin digging with the short handled spade, careful to work around each plant so as not to pierce the tubers blasted just beneath the surface. The first plant yields 5 potatoes. Good specimens, brown skinned and firm, each about the size of your fist. Lunch does not refresh you, it does not energize you. But the next yields only 3 small potatoes, one showing the telltale soft spot of blight beginning its spread. You cut away the damaged part with your knife, wondering if the rest of the potato is truly safe or if the disease has spread invisibly through its flesh. In 2 months, it won't matter. You'll eat whatever you have, blighted or not, because the alternative is worse. But for now, you still have the luxury of choice, of still trying to store only what will keep. The work continues plant by plant, row by row. Despite the layer of straw you kneel on, your knees are wet, the cold seeping through your skirt and settling into your bones. Each potato is examined with a meticulousness born of bitter experience. The firm ones go into the good pile, any showing signs of damage or disease are set aside for immediate use. The truly rotten are tree line, to feed the crows perhaps, if nothing else. The sun dips toward the horizon at an hour that seems unreasonably early, for you know it is only October, and the days will grow shorter yet. Terrifyingly short, until in December the sun barely crests the horizon before sinking back into dark. You work faster now, racing the failing light, pulling up the remaining potato plants as carefully, shaking them roughly to dislodge the tubers, trusting to luck and experience to find them all. When the darkness finally forces you to stop, your harvest fills 3 large baskets. Maybe 200 pounds of potatoes, less than you'd hoped for, but more than you'd feared. You haul them inside in painful trips, your back screaming in protest, piling them in the corner farthest from the stove, where they will stay cool but not freeze, while you prepare their final resting place. Your husband returns as you are finishing, his face ruddy from cold and exertion. He has been in the forest since dawn, felling dead wood and dragging it back for fuel. The work is absolutely necessary, but it also means he can't help with all these other tasks. Neither of you speaks of the division of labor. It is simply the way of things dictated by necessity and a habit older than your grandparents. He brings news from the forest. He has seen signs of an early heavy snow, a certain quality to the clans and the way the birds were acting, readable only to those who live close to the land like letters on a page. It means the work must proceed even faster, but tomorrow you must accomplish more than today's back-minus breaking effort. The evening hours are spent preparing for the next day's work. You sort the potatoes carefully by firelight, dividing them into piles by size and condition. The largest, most perfect will be your seed stock for next year. They must be protected at all costs, stored in the best spot in the cellar where temperature and humidity are most stable. The next tier, good quality, firm, with only minor flaws, will be the main winter food. Those that are damaged, small, that you are less confident about, will be eaten first in the coming weeks, before their flaws can prove fatal. As you work, you can't help counting and calculating again and again 3 mouths to feed, yourself, your husband, your young son sleeping now behind the curtain hung in the corner. About 6 months, until the ground falls enough to think of fresh food. October, November, December, January, February, March, possibly even April. This far north, 200 pounds of potatoes, 60 cabbages, maybe 30 pounds of turnips, 20 of carrots, whatever beets you can harvest tomorrow. How do you make those numbers stretch over half a year? How do you account for spoilage, the inevitable rotten loss to mice and plain bad luck? You've played this game before, this grim arithmetic of survival. You know that by February, the cellar will smell of earth and decay, that no matter how carefully you check, some vegetables will have gone soft, spoiled. You know that by March, you'll be eating things you wouldn't have considered food in October, scraping mold off cheese, patting away the worst of the rot, consuming what remains. The crocks for fermenting stand ready in the corner. These heavy clay vessels were your grandmother's, brought with her to Siberia 40 years ago, when she was a young bride, sent east with her husband to settle new lands. In these crocks, you will pack shredded cabbage in layers with salt, pressing it down with force until its own juices well up to cover everything. The fermentation that follows the slow transformation of cabbage into sauerkraut over weeks and months is half magic, half chemistry. It is a process you don't fully understand but have learned to control through observation and ritual. The salt is precious, almost as precious as the food itself. The small bag you bought at great cost last spring must be rationed carefully enough to properly preserve the cabbage and salt a few fish, but not so much that you run out before late winter. There is a balance, a perfect proportion you aim for each year and sometimes achieve. When you finally collapse into bed, your muscles have passed beyond pain into a kind of numb heaviness. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, more harvesting, more hauling, more calculation. The day after, and the day after that, until either the work is done or the weather makes it impossible. You lie in the dark, listening to your husband's breathing settle into sleep, and you think of the cellar. Tomorrow, before anything else, you must inspect it thoroughly. The cellar is everything. Your bank, your insurance, your hedge against nature's malicious caprice. It waits for you underground, just outside your dwelling, access through a low doorway you must bend to enter. The structure is simple, a pit dug maybe 8 feet down into the earth, into the permafrost that never falls, lined with logs to prevent collapse, roofed over with a slanted cover of planks and earth, to shed rain and snow. Inside, rough shelves line the walls, and the floor is covered with sand to absorb moisture and provide a bed for burying vegetables. The air in the cellar holds a particular quality cold, but not freezing damp, but not wet still, heavy, silent as the inside of a tomb. You've heard stories of cellars collapsing, an entire winter's stores buried under tons of frozen earth, of cellars flooding, or somehow growing too warm so that everything spouted or rotted at once, of mice finding entrance through cracks no wider than a finger, breeding in the dark, eating everything stored there while the family above knew nothing until it was too late. These stories visit you in the moments before sleep and welcome guests, slipping past the guards of your consciousness despite your efforts to bolt the door. What if your cellar has a crack you hadn't noticed? What if this winter brings such cold that even the cellar freezes solid? What if you've miscalculated, harvested too little, and by February you're watching your child growth in and quiet? Sleep, when it comes, is fitful, unsatisfying. You dream of endless vegetables, of digging in frozen earth and finding nothing, of opening the cellar door to find it empty, the shelves bare, your carefully husbanded dead stores vanished like smoke. The next day begins before dawn. Dawn means little now, the sun rising so late and setting so early that day feels like a brief interruption in an ongoing darkness. You bundle yourself in layers of wool and felt, take a flickering oil lamp, precious fuel but unavoidable, and head for the cellar. The door is swollen a bit with damp, and you struggle to open it, descending the rough steps into the earth. The lamp casts wild shadows on the log walls, and you can see your breath fogging in the cold air. The smell down here is distinctive: earth, wood, and something mineral, ancient, the smell of the earth itself. You examine every shelf carefully, running your hands over the logs, checking for soft spots that might indicate rot. You examine the corners where the walls meet the floor, looking for the telltale scratch marks and droppings that signal mice. You study the sand on the floor, checking its dampness, making sure it has become too wet or too dry. The inspection brings both relief and anxiety: no major problems, no disaster waiting to happen, but also no perfection, no guarantee. One shelf has a slight sag that worries you. It will need reinforcement before you load it with heavy sacks of potatoes. There is a spot near the door where damp seems to be seeping through the log lining. Not enough to be an immediate problem, but it could worsen as the winter progresses. Your husband spends the morning making the repairs while you return to the harvest. The beets are easier than the potatoes, their bulbous shapes sliding from the loosened earth with a satisfying pop. They are beautiful things, deep red globes that seem to glow even in the dull autumn light. Each one is a small miracle of concentrated sweetness and nutrition. These will be stored specially, buried in layers of sand in the coldest corner of the cellar. All winter long, you will descend to retrieve them one at a time, brushing off the sand to reveal their ruby flesh. Boiled and sliced, they will bring color to the winter diet of browns and whites, a reminder that the world once held light and variety. The onions are your last major harvest, bringing their own unique challenges. Each one must be pulled gently to avoid bruising the bulb, then must be cured in the weak sun for days before the tops can be braided together for storage. But you don't have days. The snow your husband predicted could come at any time. You compromise, spreading the onions on planks inside near the stove, where the warmth will help them cure faster. The pungent smell fills your dwelling, making your eyes water, but also bringing the strange comfort, the smell of food, of provisions, of having something put by. Over the next week, you fall into a rhythm that is both exhausting and strangely meditative. Each morning brings the same tasks: checking what has been harvested, culling anything that has spoiled overnight, preparing the next batch for storage. Each afternoon means more work in the cellar, arranging and rearranging, trying to optimize every inch of space, every wisp of cool air. The potatoes go into the sand in layers, the best ones in the center where the temperature is most stable. The cabbages not destined for fermentation are wrapped individually in cloth and stacked carefully on the shelves. The carrots, turnips, and beets all find their places, each kind of vegetable separate from the others to prevent flavors from mingling and to make retrieval in the dark winter months easier. On a cold afternoon, with your husband back in the forest, you begin the fermentation process. The precision of the work is satisfying. Each cabbage quartered, the core removed, the leaves sliced into thin ribbons with your sharpest knife. They go into the crock in layers, each layer sprinkled with salt, not too much, not too little, the exact amount your grandmother taught your mother and your mother taught you. You press down hard with clean hands, compacting the cabbage, forcing it to release its juices. More cabbage, more salt, more pressing until the crock is nearly full to the brim and the brine has risen to cover everything. A clean cloth goes on top, then a wooden disc, and finally a heavy stone to weight it all down. Now comes the waiting, the fermentation, the slow transformation of the cabbage over the months. For the first few days, you must check it frequently, skimming off any scum that forms, making sure the brine level remains high. After that, if all goes well, the fermentation will proceed on its own. By midwinter you will have tangy, sour sauerkraut to provide crucial vitamins when fresh food is a memory. The first real snow comes on a morning in late October, drift down from a leaden sky. It's early still, just a dusting that melts by noon, that you and your husband exchange a look that carries volumes of unspoken communication. The deadline has arrived. The remaining work takes on a frantic edge, even as you try to maintain the same careful attention. There are still herbs to be gathered and dried, bundles hung from the rafters where the air circulates and they are safe from mice. There are still late mushrooms to be collected in the forest, which will bring precious flavor to winter soups. Your husband brings home a haunch of moose meat, traded from a neighbor. The precious meat must be eaten immediately or preserved. You choose preservation, cutting the meat into thin strips, rubbing each strip with salt, hanging them in your small smokehouse, where a smoldering fire of green alder will slowly cure them over days. This meat represents protein, strength, the possibility of keeping muscle and health through the long months. But it also represents risk. If the smoking process goes wrong, if moisture remains in the meat, if the temperature isn't right, the entire haunch could rot, be lost. You tend the smokehouse fire with an obsessive care, checking it every few hours through the day, adding small pieces of wood to maintain a thin wisp of smoke, adjusting the draft by moving planks that serve as simple baffles. The smell of smoking meat permeates the area around your homestead, and you know your neighbors smell it too, making their own calculations about their relative plenty or desperation. By early November, the true cold has set in. The kind of cold that seems to solidify the air itself, that freezes your breath into crystals on your eyelashes, that makes the snow under your boots groan and squeak. The small stream that runs past your settlement has begun to freeze. A delicate shelf of ice forms along the edges, reaching farther toward the center each day. You make one last trip down into the cellar before the deep winter sets in, for a final inventory and check. The shelves are full, but not crowded. You've learned that vegetables need space around them, need air circulation, or they will rot from contact and contagion. The sand on the floor is at the right dampness. The temperature hovers just above freezing. The smell is clean and earthy, with no hint of decay. You count the sacks, estimate the weights, run the arithmetic one more time. 200 pounds of potatoes, 50 cabbages after fermentation, maybe 30 pounds of root vegetables, dried mushrooms, smoked meat, the small portion of grain and flour you've managed to set aside. Beyond that, the occasional luxuries acquired through trade or purchase, a little tea, some sugar, precious salt beyond what you've already used. The numbers say you should make it, should live to see spring. Should, but the word offers no guarantees, makes no promises. In the settlement records, her name appears in neat script: Presko Vuzanoven, born 1791, married 1809, mother of 6 children. But the records cannot capture what made her extraordinary, cannot convey the particular way she understood the mathematics of winter, the instinct she possessed for measuring survival against the cold dark's relentless advance. She was born into a winter that nearly destroyed her family. Her father had been sent east as part of a resettlement program. one of thousands of peasants pushed into Siberia to occupy the land and establish a Russian presence in territories known only to indigenous peoples and the occasional Cossack outpost. The journey itself was an ordeal lasting months, the family traveling with other settlers in creaking wagons, slowly traversing a landscape that grew stranger and more forbidding. Other was pregnant during the trip, her belly growing larger as the forests thickened and settlements grew fewer, until they finally reached their allotted land in late autumn with barely enough time to throw up a dwelling before the snows came. That first winter on their new land, when Preskovaya was just 3 months old, the family discovered too late that the root cellar they had hurriedly built was in a spot that was too warm. The potatoes they stored sprouted in January, sending out pale, crusting tendrils in the dark, draining themselves of nourishment and substance. Her father, in his desperation to have the cellar finished before the ground froze completely, had chosen the location without yet understanding how the soil behaved in these new latitudes. By February, her parents were boiling leather, feeding the family a thin gruel made from ground birch barky substance that filled the belly without truly nourishing the body, sustaining life in the barest sense while the body slowly consumed itself. Her infant brother died in March, simply stopping his breath one cold morning, his small body already thin as a bird's. Her mother never spoke of that winter, but Preskovaya absorbed its lessons anyway, learning them somehow in the wordless way children understand the great traumas that shaped their families. The silence surrounding that first winter became its own instruction, a warning passed down not through words but through her others near minus compulsive attention to food storage in all the years that followed. She grew up watching her mother with an intense focus, mimicking her movements in the cellar, learning to read the subtle signs most people missed. She learned to judge a potato's firmness with her fingertips, to smell the difference between healthy fermentation and the beginnings of rot. She memorized the feel of meat smoked just right, the look of mushrooms dried properly, the sound of snow that presaged a serious storm coming. There were less quantifiable lessons: the importance of starting preparations early when plenty made it easy to forget the coming scarcity, the necessity of maintaining the storage spaces with near minus religious diligence, the way small oversight could cascade into disaster over the long winter. Other checked the cellar every 3 days all winter long. No matter the weather, no matter how tired she was. And from the time Preskovaya could walk, she accompanied her on those inspections. By the time she married at 18, moving from Herb Aronstead to her husband's settlement 3 days' travel to the east, she brought with her an knowledge that seemed almost preternatural to those who didn't know its source. She could walk into a root cellar and simply know whether the food stored there would last the winter or run short by March. The journey to the new home took place in late autumn, the landscape already bare and grey, preparing for winter. She traveled by sled with her few possessions, her husband Mikhail walking beside the horse, the two of them mostly silent, as they traversed the space between her old life and her new one. Her husband Mikhail was a trapper, a quiet man who spent weeks at a time in the forest pursuing sable and fox. This meant Preskovaya was left alone for long stretches to manage the homestead, making all the decisions about planting, harvesting, and storage without the counsel otherwise relied on. She didn't mind the solitude, found it suited her temperament in ways she hadn't anticipated. In fact, she found she preferred making decisions based on her own observations, rather than deferring to a husband's judgment that might or might not be sound. Their first winter together tested her thoroughly, revealing the gap between her understanding and his. Mikhail was optimistic in his preparations, storing what he thought was enough. But Preskovaya's instincts told her it was barely adequate. She said nothing, unwilling to criticize so early in the marriage. But she quietly implemented her own measures, stretching each meal a little further, finding ways to make the stores last that her husband never noticed. She began taking smaller portions for herself, claiming she wasn't hungry, when in truth she was simply calculating, always calculating how many days the food needed to cover. They made it through that winter in comfort, and Mikhail believed his preparations had been sufficient. Preskovaya let him think so, understanding already that sometimes wisdom meant allowing others their illusions, but pride could be a useful thing when it motivated rather than endangered. The settlement they lived in consisted of maybe 20 families, scattered along a valley where a tributary of the Yeniseiasi provided water and a transportation route in the brief summer. The families helped each other when possible, that resources were too scarce for true generosity, and it was an unspoken hierarchy of obligation. You helped blood relatives first, then your closest neighbors, then others only if you had true surplus. Every household lived in a state of constant, quiet calculation, always weighing what they had against what they would need. The mathematics of survival weren't ever simple, never certain. Too many variables, too many possibilities for disaster, for upsetting even the most carefully laid preparations. Peskovaya first became known for small things, for observations that seemed trivial until proven correct. A neighbor woman asked her about some potatoes, whether they were too far gone to store. Peskovaya looked and said yes, they would rot by January and contaminate everything near them. The woman, unconvinced, perhaps thinking Peskovaya was being overly cautious or didn't really understand how storage worked, stored them anyway. In January, she found Peskovaya had been exactly right. The questionable potatoes did rot, and the rot spread to everything on the same shelf, forcing her to discard nearly a quarter of her winter stores. Another time, a young couple newly arrived from European Russia asked Peskovaya to inspect this cellar before they filled it, having heard from someone that she had an eye for such things. She went down into the earth with a candle, examined the structure, and pointed out a gap in the log lining where field mice would surely find entrance, and possibly larger rodents. They spent the better part of a day sealing the gap with clay and stone, making it secure. That winter, of the new settlers, only they did not suffer losses to rodents. Word spread quietly through the isolated community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputation was built on accumulated small proofs rather than dramatic displays. Peskovaya became someone to consult, usually privately, often with a gift of thanks pressed into her hand a few eggs, some wild berries, once a beautiful wooden spoon she used for the rest of her life. She never claimed expertise or flaunted her knowledge, instinctively understanding that displays of superiority bred resentment in a community where everyone was relatively equal in status. When people asked how she knew these things, she would shrug and say she learned it from observation, which was partly true. But there was more, something less easy to articulate, an empathic understanding of how preservation worked, of how vegetables breathed and changed in storage, of how meat cured, of how fermentation could be managed or could go catastrophically wrong. She seemed to possess an ability to extrapolate forward from present conditions to see in August what February might bring, to understand how small decisions compounded over time to create either plenty or scarcity. It was mystical, though some viewed it that way. It was observation and pattern recognition applied with discipline and without sentiment. The winter of 1825 brought her first real test as an unofficial leader, the first time her knowledge was needed to serve more than a single household. Late spring frost had killed much of the settlement's potato crop. The freeze came in early June, when the plants were still tender, blackening the leaves and killing the tubers underground. By August it was clear the harvest would be severely short, maybe only 60% of a normal year. The settlement held a meeting in the small wooden church, the priest asking each family to estimate their stores, to declare honestly what they had so the community could assess the overall situation. Peskovaya could see immediately that the estimates were dangerously optimistic, based on hope rather than reality. People were counting vegetables that woodland keep, failing to account for the inevitable spoilage and pest loss, overestimating the nutritive value of what they had preserved. She stood up in the meeting, which was unusual. Women did not typically speak in such gatherings unless directly asked, or unless the topic was specifically within their acknowledged realm, household matters. But she stood, and very calmly said that if everyone was honest about what they truly had, and if they pulled certain resources and managed them collectively, they could all survive, but only if they began rationing immediately in August, not when scarcity became apparent. The men in the room looked at her with expressions ranging from skepticism to hostility, unaccustomed to hearing a woman's voice in matters of community governance. Her own husband looked uncomfortable, torn between pride in her knowledge and embarrassment at her breach of social convention. But the priest, an educated man from Moscow, who had been in Siberia long enough to recognize wisdom wherever it would explain her reasoning. Father Dmitri had seen enough winters to understand that survival sometimes required setting aside pride and convention, that intelligence had no particular gender when hunger was the alternative. She did, laying out the mathematics of survival in terms even the most stubborn could understand, speaking slowly and clearly, stating her case with numbers and logic rather than emotion. She proposed that families with the best cellars and storage capacity take in food from those with poorer facilities, holding it in trust and distributing it back as needed, preventing losses from inadequate storage conditions. She proposed they establish a common smokehouse where meat could be preserved more efficiently, sharing expertise and consolidating resources. The current system, where each family maintained its own inadequate smoking facility, led to waste the community could no longer afford. The discussion that followed was heated, full of suspicion, wounded pride, and fear. The men argued about property rights and independence, while their wives sat in silence, mentally calculating whether their own families could survive alone. But in the end, enough families agreed to try Praskovya's system that it became the settlement's unofficial policy adopted not through consensus, but through the simple mathematics of survival. The winter played out as she predicted, unfolding with the grim inevitability she had foreseen. By November, the families who had refused to participate in the common storage were already running short, looking at their neighbors' stores with poorly concealed envy, beginning to regret their proud insistence on independence. By January, 2 of those families were begging for help, coming to the common stores with thin children and desperate faces, their pride finally broken by necessity. The common stores, carefully managed, were able to provide enough to keep them alive. The Praskovya made it clear the rations came with an expectation these families would need to contribute more labor to the collective next season, would need to acknowledge that their survival was bought with the foresight of others. By March, when settlements normally began to fracture under the strain of dwindling stores and cabin fever, when tempers frayed and old grievances resurfaced with the venom bred of long hardship, Praskovya's system held them together. The shared smokehouse meant families could trade labor for smoked meat, creating a web of obligation and reciprocity that bound the community more tightly than simple proximity. The common storage cellar, managed in rotation by different families, meant everyone knew how much food remained and could plan accordingly, removing the uncertainty and suspicion that came from not knowing if your neighbor was holding. They all lived to see spring, though in some cases just barely, though by April they were eating things that barely qualified as food: the inner bark of certain trees, roots dug from the partially thawed earth, anything that could provide even the barest minimum of calories. But no one starved that year, which was more than many settlements could claim, more than several communities within 100 miles manage. After that winter, Praskovya's role in the community became formalized in an unspoken way, her authority acknowledged without ever being officially granted. Not just on an individual level, but the settlement as a whole would consult her on matters of food storage and winter preparation. When new families arrived, the priest would send them to Praskovya to learn the particular requirements of survival at these latitudes, in this climate, with these resources, understanding that her instruction was as vital to their survival as their physical strength or knowledge of farming. She bore 6 children over the years, 4 of whom survived infancy, to daughters and to sons who grew strong and learned their mother's lessons. She raised them with the same meticulousness and preparation she applied to food storage, understanding that survival skills needed to be passed down, that knowledge itself was a kind of wealth in a place where material wealth is always scarce. They learned from the earliest age not to waste anything, to plan ahead, to respect the power of winter and the absolute necessity of proper preparation. Her children could estimate quantities with startling accuracy by age 7, judge the quality of preserved food by 10, manage a cellar's contents independently by adolescence. Her daughters married into other settlements, taking their mother's knowledge with them, spreading Praskovya's methods to a wider region. Her sons settled nearby, establishing their own homesteads within a day's walk, and they would bring their wives to Praskovya each autumn to have their winter stores inspected, maintaining this ritual even after they had established their own households and authority. The inspections became a ritual that was anticipated, sometimes feared, but always respected. I would arrive at a homestead in late October, after the main harvest was in, by sled if snow had already fallen, on foot, if the ground was still bare. She would descend into the cellar with the family, examining their stores with her careful, experienced hands, offering advice or approval depending on what she found. Sometimes her advice was small: move these potatoes to a different shelf. There to close to the wall where cold might penetrate, store the carrots, and rather than loose, check this corner more frequently. There's a scent that suggests damp is gathering. Sometimes it was major: your cellar is too warm. It needs to be dug deeper or relocated. The salted meat doesn't have enough salt. It should be eaten first before it spoils. Your stores are far from adequate. You need to acquire more provisions immediately or plan to seek help by late winter. People learned to heed her advice because they had seen too often the consequences of not heeding it, had witnessed the springtime suffering of families that could have been avoided with better preparation. She was not always gentle in her assessments, understanding that false comfort was a cruelty when survival hung in the balance. Where she saw laziness or poor judgment, she spoke plainly, her voice calm but firm, making it clear that winter forgave no carelessness, no matter the excuse offered. A young man who had spent too much of the autumn hunting, and not enough preparing his stores, received a tongue-lashing from Prescovia that left him flushed and resentful, but alive the following spring. She told him bluntly that pride in his hunting skill meant nothing if his family starved, that providing fresh meat in October was useless if there was no cured meat in February, that he needed to think beyond the immediate gratification of a successful hunt till a long liner's range with thematics of winter's survival. The winter of 1829 tested everything she had built, challenging her system in ways no one anticipated. It began with rains in September, and seasonably heavy rains that soaked the ground, made harvesting difficult, turned the fields to mire that clung to boots, and made carts almost impossible to use. Then came an early frost, the deep cold arriving weeks ahead of schedule, catching families with crops still in the ground, with work still unfinished. The settlements scrambled to salvage what they could, digging potatoes and root vegetables from earth that was already half-frozen, pulling up cabbages damaged by the premature cold, knowing even as they worked that much of what they harvested was already compromised. Many families lost a significant portion of their crop, not precisely to rot, but to frost damage that meant the vegetables would spoil faster in storage, their cellular structure broken by ice crystals that had fallen within and expanded. Then in November came the blizzard, announcing itself with the particular silence veteran Siberian winter. Minus dwellers learned to recognize instantly the stillness in the air, the change in pressure that makes the ears pop, the dogs whining and pacing and scratching at the door as if they could flee what was coming. The snow began in the late afternoon and did not stop for 3 days, falling so densely you couldn't see your hand at arm's length. The wind drove it, shrieking and howling, finding every crack in every wall, piling snow against buildings until some were airy to the eaves, making travel impossible, turning the familiar landscape into a strange, featureless white waste. The temperature dropped to depths that made the air itself seem a hostile presence, eager to steal warmth and life from anything exposed to it. On the second day of the blizzard, the roof of the Val-Ov family's home collapsed under the weight of the snow. The supporting beam finally gave way with a sound like thunder, dumping tons of snow into the living space below. They managed to escape with their lives, but lost everything inside: winter clothes, cooking equipment, most of their stored food. Worse, the collapse damaged the entrance to their root cellar, and snow poured into the cellar itself, inundating and freezing everything on the lower shelves, ruining the vegetables and contaminating what remained with ice water that then froze solid, creating a chaos of ice and ruined food. When the storm finally abated, Prescovia waded through knee-minus deep snow to assess the damage, fighting through drifts that had turned familiar paths into obstacle courses. The Val-Ov family had lost roughly half their winter stores. That alone wasn't fatal, but it put them in serious danger for the weeks ahead. Without help, they'd certainly face starvation by March. She called another settlement meeting, this time in the neighbor's barn where the Valovi family was temporarily sheltering. The family huddled together for warmth, while their neighbors crowded in to discuss their fate. The situation was discussed with the frank clarity that emergencies sometimes allow, without the social niceties that can obscure the grim mathematics of survival. The Valovverses needed help, but after the poor harvest and early winter, every family's margin was thin this year. Preskovia proposed a rationing system for the entire settlement, an extension of the common storage model they had used before. Each family would contribute a small portion of their stores to support the Valovverses through the crisis. The amount was carefully calculated, enough to make a real difference to the family in need, but not so much as to endanger the other contributors. A delicate balance that required knowing exactly what each household hadn't needed. Some families objected, arguing that the Valovverses should have built a sturdier roof, should have been more careful, that their misfortune was in some way their own fault and therefore not the community's responsibility. Preskovia listened to the objections, then said simply, "It could have been any of us." Her voice carried the weight of years spent managing survival on the edge of disaster. The snow load had been unprecedented, the storm unpredictable, and assigning blame served no practical purpose. Next year it might be another family facing catastrophe through no fault of their own. When that happened, they would want the same generosity they were being asked to show now. Her argument was dissuasive, or perhaps it was simply that people had learned to trust Preskovia's judgment, had seen her be right too many times to doubt her now. The rationing system was implemented, and the Valovverses received enough to survive, though their diet that winter was meager, their situation precarious until spring arrived. But the storm revealed another problem, exposing a vulnerability the community hadn't fully recognized. As Preskovia went from house to house collecting contributions, she discovered that other families had also suffered significant losses, though not as dramatically as the Valovverses' roof collapse. The Karpov family's cellar had developed a leak, water seeping in from somewhere, freezing, expanding, packing the log lining and letting in more water, in a destructive cycle. The Borovi family's smokehouse had been torn apart by the wind, the structure ripped apart by the storm's sustained fury, all they cured meat, months of work and precious protein scattered across the snow. The cumulative effect of these disasters meant the entire settlement was in greater danger than anyone had initially realized. Their collective buffer of stored food, the surplus that was supposed to see them comfortably to spring, had been eroded by the combination of poor harvest and stormed energy, leaving a perilously thin margin. Preskovia spent a sleepless night, doing calculations, moving quantities around in her mind like pieces on a chessboard, trying to find a configuration that would work, that would let everyone live. In the morning she went to the priest with a proposal that was both radical and absolutely necessary, one that demanded the community trust her more completely than ever before. They needed to centralize food storage more completely than they ever had, consolidating everything into a few cellars that had proven most reliable. The best cellars would hold everything, with strict record miners keeping and regular distributions. The system would give her and a few others complete control over the community's food supply. Families would receive weekly rations based on size and need. No more hoarding. No private stores beyond a few days' worth. It meant giving up control, meant trusting the collective more than most felt comfortable, meant accepting that your survival depended not just on your own preparations, but on the honesty and competence of others. It meant families that had prepared carefully would have to support families that perhaps had not, violating the deep minus-seated principle of personal responsibility that governed frontier life. But Preskovia argued it was their only chance. Together, they had enough. Separately, some of them would surely starve, and she was willing to stake her reputation on that assertion. The priest backed her, giving the proposal legitimacy. Father Dimitri's support provided a weight she might not have possessed on her own. The families agreed, one by one, though some required more persuasion. Some needed the mathematics laid out in detail before they would accept that their individual autonomy needed to be sacrificed for collective survival. By December, the new system was in place, with Preskovia and two other women managing the central stores and distributions. A triumvirate of survival. The responsibility weighed on her heavily, like a physical burden she carried constantly, even in sleep. She understood she was now personally responsible for the survival of over 100 people, that every calculation about how much to distribute, about how much remained, carried the weight of life and death. Every mistake she made, every misjudgment, could mean someone's starving a child, an elder, a father or mother, their death rippling through families and generations. She checked the cellars obsessively, descending into the cold earth every few days, turning vegetables, removing anything showing signs of spoilage, monitoring temperature and humidity with near-minus religious attention. Nights she lay awake doing arithmetic, trying to account for every possible variable. What if the cold lasted into May as it did in the worst years? Sometimes. What if more food spoiled faster than anticipated despite her careful management? What if someone fell ill and needed extra nourishment, consuming more than the standard ration? What if spring came late? What if the ground stayed frozen into June? If they needed to stretch supplies beyond all reasonable expectation? January and February passed in a kind of collective endurance, each day blurring into the next, grey and monotonous, broken only by the weekly distribution of rations. Prascovia's allocations were adequate, but meagre enough to sustain life and basic function, enough to prevent actual starvation, but not enough to ever feel truly satisfied, not enough to keep a constant, low-level hunger from being every owner's companion. Hunger became a constant companion for everyone, not the acute hunger that means immediate danger, but the chronic low-level hunger that saps energy, makes every task feel heavier, shortens tempers, lengthens the nights. People moved more slowly, conserving energy, staying indoors where warmth could be maintained more efficiently. There were complaints, inevitably, as there always are when people are uncomfortable and see no immediate relief. Some families felt they weren't getting a fair share, or that their contribution had been undervalued, that they deserved more based on their initial preparations or the size of their contribution to the common stores. Some men resented depending on a system managed by women, felt it was unnatural or unseemly that their survival depended on the decisions of someone's wife, rather than the male heads of the settlement. Praskovia handled each complaint with patient firmness, showing her records, explaining her reasoning, refusing to be intimidated or cajoled into changing allocations she knew were right. She kept meticulous records, writing down every distribution, every contribution, every adjustment, creating a written account that anyone who doubted her fairness could examine. In March, the worst month, when winter seems like it will never end, when supplies have dwindled to the point where everyone is afraid, when even Praskovia's cautious optimism was tested by the reality of what remained, she made a discovery. In one of the cellars behind some empty sacks, she found a cache of potatoes that had been hidden away, someone's private stock, withheld from the common stores in violation of the agreement everyone had made. The potatoes weren't many enough to feed a family for 2 weeks. But they represented a betrayal of the collective trust the system depended on, represented a private insurance policy purchased at the expense of the community's survival. She never revealed whose cash it was, understanding that public shaming would fracture the community in ways that could be fatal. But she confiscated the potatoes, distributing them according to the same rationing system, adding them to the common supply without comment. It was a reminder to everyone that the system only worked if everyone participated honestly. No more hidden caches were found after that, or if they existed, no one was foolish enough to leave them where Praskovia might discover them on an inspection. When spring finally arrived in late April, it felt like a resurrection, like the world remaking itself after a long death. The first patches of bare ground showing through the snow, the first drip of icicles from the eaves, the first birds returning from the south. Every sign of winter's retreat was celebrated with quiet relief, with the easing of a tension that had become almost unbearable over the long months. Everyone had lost weight, some particularly the elderly grown frighteningly thin, their faces gaunt, their movements slow. But they were alive, and Praskovia's careful management of their collective resources had made the difference, had been the line between survival and disaster. In the years that followed, the common storage system became permanent, evolving and improving with experience, adapted by the people to their specific needs and circumstances. Other settlements heard about it and adopted similar practices, sending representatives to learn from Preskovaya, carrying her methods to communities scattered across hundreds of miles of Siberian wilderness. Preskova's reputation spread beyond her immediate community, and occasionally people would travel a considerable distance to consult her on winter preparation and food storage, coming with questions and leading with knowledge that might save lives. She never sought recognition or praise for what she did, never advertised her expertise or claimed special status. To her, it was simply necessary, the result of applying observation and calculation to the problem of survival, of paying attention and thinking ahead as a matter of natural course. But those who knew her understood that her quiet stewardship had saved lives, preserved families, given the settlement a resilience it would not otherwise have possessed. As she aged, the years accumulating, her hair turning grey then white, Preskovaya began to teach her methods to others, particularly to younger women who showed an aptitude for the meticulous observation and prudent judgment that effective food management required. She understood that knowledge needed to be passed on, that systems needed to outlast the people who created them, that she would die eventually and the community needed to be prepared for that loss. She worked specifically with 3 women, teaching them not just the practical skills, but the underlying principles, the way of thinking that allowed for prediction and planning. She taught them to recognize patterns, to extrapolate from small signs to large conclusions, to trust intuition when that intuition was based on experience and observation. She died in the early spring of 1854, just as the river ice was beginning to break up, the sound of it cracking like distant thunder echoing through the valley. She had gone down into a cellar to check on some potatoes that were causing concern, felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest, overwhelming and final, and managed only to make it back to the stairs before she fell, her body finally demanding the rest it had so long been denied. Her daughter found her lying in the dirt near the cellar entrance, already gone, her face peaceful in a way it rarely had been in life. They buried her in the small cemetery by the church once the ground was soft enough to dig, where others from the settlement also rested. The priest spoke of her contributions to the community, her wisdom, her education, searching for words to capture a life lived mostly without drama or fanfare, but always with purpose. But Preskova's true memorial was not the funeral or the words at the graveside, not the wooden marker carved by her sons or Father Demetrius' prayers. It was the settlement itself, surviving brutal winter after brutal winter, managing their collective resources with the system she had pioneered, adapting and improving upon her foundation. It was the women she had trained continuing her work, teaching the next generation, passing on not just techniques, but an entire philosophy of survival based on preparation, cooperation, and careful observation. It was a life saved by careful preparation, the families that continued, because someone had understood the mathematics of survival and cared enough to implement it, even when resistance seemed overwhelming. In the settlement records, her death was naked with the same neat script that had recorded her birth. Preskovaya Ivanovna died 1854, aged 63 years, survived by 4 children and 11 grandchildren, but the records could not capture her true essence. The quiet architect of survival, a woman who understood that winter's greatest challenge was not the cold itself, but the human tendency to underestimate it, to hope rather than prepare, to individualize what needed to be collectivized. She recognized the survival under such extreme conditions required both technical knowledge and social organization, that neither alone was sufficient, but together they could create a resilience no single household could achieve. Her grave weathered subsided, the wooden marker eventually rotting away, replaced once and then lost entirely as newer graves demanded attention and memory. But long after her name faded from memory, long after no one who had known her personally remained, the system she created continued to function, adapted and improved by generations who never knew her name, but benefited from her wisdom. The settlement grew over the decades, adding families, expanding its territory, eventually becoming significant enough to be marked on maps, to receive regular visits from government officials, to participate in the larger economic networks connecting Siberia to European Russia. But through all that development and change, the common storage system remained, modernized, but fundamentally still recognizable as Prascovia's creation, a testament to the enduring value of her insight. Sometimes in deep autumn, when the first heavy snows begin to fall, when the women go down into the summers to check the winter stores, they do so with a particular meticulousness, a careful thoroughness they might not be able to explain, but that comes from knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that began with one woman's determination not to let her community go hungry, not to let winter take anyone she could save, through foresight, careful planning, and an unyielding commitment to collective survival. Deep in the Siberian taiga, in settlements long abandoned, where the forest has reclaimed the clearings humans once carved from the wilderness, archaeologists occasionally uncover structures not easily explained. These are called wells, cylindrical shafts sunk 15, sometimes 20 feet down into the earth, into soil that stays frozen near modest round, their walls lined with logs in a pattern that suggests both engineering sophistication and something like ritual significance. The first documented discovery was in 1923, when a Soviet geological survey team working near the Lena River found what they initially thought was an old mine shaft. But there were no signs of mineral extraction, no tailings, no worked stone. Instead, the shaft was a perfect cylinder, its walls lined with birch logs fitted so precisely that even after what might have been a century, water had never seeped through the seams. The team leader, geologist Mikhail Sokolov, wrote in his field journal that the precision of the joinery reminded him of fine furniture, not the rough work expected of frontier settlers struggling for survival. At the bottom of that first well, the archaeologists found a layer of what seemed to be intentionally placed permafrost, soiled earth from deeper frozen layers and laid as a floor. Mixed into this permafrost layer were fragments of bone, bits of birch bark, and what might have been hide, all preserved in the eternal cold like artifacts sealed in ice. The discovery sparked interest but yielded no immediate answers. The well was documented, measured, photographed, then largely forgotten as political turmoil consumed Soviet attention. Decades would pass before anyone returned to the site with serious archaeological intent. In the intervening years, the forest continued its patient work of reclamation, the well's mouth partially obscured by moss and fallen branches. Nature slowly erased the evidence of human intervention. In the 1970s, a team from Kuznetskaya University began systematically searching for similar structures across eastern Siberia. They found 17 more cold wells in a relatively concentrated geographic area. All shared certain common features, but each was different in subtle ways. The wells ranged in depth from 12 to 20 feet, in diameter from 4 to 6 feet. Large enough for a person to descend, small enough that digging required immense labor. One researcher calculated that digging a well in frozen ground using tools available in the 18th from 19th century would require hundreds of hours of work, possibly thousands if the ground was particularly hard. What most impressed the researchers was the sophistication of the construction. These were not simply holes dug into permafrost. The log lining showed evidence of careful selection, birch primarily, lash in some cases, both woods known for resistance to rot. The logs were debarked, shaped to fit precisely, and arranged in a spiral pattern, a design that seemed intended to prevent any shifting or collapse as the ground frozen thawed around it. Some wells showed evidence at the top of having had a wooden platform or grate, long since rotted away, but leaving traces in the form of support being anchored in the surrounding ground. This suggested the wells had been covered, protected from rain and snow, accessible only by removing the covering, a design that would help maintain a stable temperature inside. But the greatest mystery lay in what the wells had contained, or what purpose they had served. Excavations revealed layers of organic matter that told a partial story. Fish bones concentrated in certain strata, suggesting large minor-scale storage of salted fish. Fragments of what might have been wooden containers, their shapes almost unrecognizable after decades or centuries of decay. Seeds of berries that grow in the region, sometimes in quantities that suggested they had been stored in bulk. A well discovered near the Kalima River in 1982 yielded something particularly interesting: a layer of animal fat, somehow preserved in the permafrost at the bottom of the shaft. Chemical analysis showed it to be reindeer fat, and the quantity inferred from the extent of the layer would represent the fat of dozens of animals, a huge concentration of calories and nutrition. The question that plagued the researchers was simple. Why dig these elaborate wells, when a traditional root cellar, the kind used by Siberian settlers for centuries, would have been easier to build and served a similar purpose? The labor involved digging 20 feet down into frozen earth, lining it with precisely fitted lobes. Maintaining these structures over time all suggested the wells served a purpose beyond simple food storage. A standard root cellar, dug only 6 or 7 feet down, lined with rough logs or stone, would preserve root vegetables and some salted foods through a Siberian winter with a fraction of the effort. Some researchers suggested they were emergency caches created in years of plenty, insurance against catastrophic winters. The depth and careful construction would keep food frozen, even during the brief summer thaw, essentially creating a natural deep freeze that could preserve food for years rather than months. Others proposed a communal purpose, that the wells did not belong to individual families, but to an entire settlement, or even a regional group. The quantity of food that could be stored in a properly maintained cold well, thousands of pounds of frozen fish, meat, fat, and berries, exceeded the needs of a single household, suggesting some form of collective management. There were also cultural explanations, drawn from fragmentary records of Siberian indigenous practices and from folk memories passed down among the descendants of early Russian settlers. Some traditions spoke of winter guardians, places where food was stored not just for immediate survival, but as an offering to ensure future abundance, as insurance against nature's caprice. A particularly intriguing account came from an interview in 1989 with an elderly woman whose grandmother had been born in a settlement near the Vitin River in the 1852. According to family stories passed down, her grandmother spoke of a deep, cold place where the community stored food that was only to be accessed in true emergencies, and only with the agreement of the settlement's elders. The grandmother's story described a ritual held in autumn when the harvest was in winter preparations complete. Representatives from each family would contribute a portion of their stores, always the best of what they had, not the damaged or questionable food, to this deep, cold place. The contribution was seen as insurance, but also as an obligation, a way of binding the community together by sharing risk and pooling provision. The account emphasized the ritual aspect, the opening of the well accompanied by prayers or invitations, the placement of the food done with care and respect to the sealing of the well, marking the community's readiness for winter. According to the account, this deep, cold place was opened only twice in the grandmother's lifetime, once during a winter of catastrophic crop failure, and once following an unexpected late frost that killed most of the settlement's livestock. Each time the stored food was distributed as needed, managed by women who understood preservation and rationing, and the community survived what would otherwise have been a fatal disaster. The account is tantalizing but difficult to verify. The settlement where the grandmother lived no longer exists, swallowed by the forest decades ago. Archaeological surveys of the area have found the remnants of foundations of buildings, but no cold well, though that doesn't necessarily mean one was there. The forest keeps its secrets well, and decades of growth can conceal even fairly large structures. The researcher who conducted the interview tried to locate the site based on the old woman's descriptions, but memory and time had blurred landmarks, and what had once been peer reference points might have been altered by logging, fire, and natural succession. The archaeologists did find markings in several of the cold wells scattered across Siberia that hinted at ritual or symbolic significance. Some of the logs were carved with simple geometric patterns, lines, circles, occasionally what might be stylized representations of animals or plants. The carvings are weathered, difficult to interpret, but their presence suggests the wells were more than purely utilitarian structures. The patterns vary from well to well, with no obvious standardization, suggesting either regional variations in the practice or personal expression by the builders. One researcher examining a particularly well-mined preserved well near Yakutsk, noted that looking down from above, the spiral pattern of the log lining created a visual effect. The logs seemed to descend endlessly, creating a sense of depth that went beyond the shaft's actual physical depth. Whether this was intentional, a design choice meant to inspire art to symbolically connect the storage space with the deeper earth, remains speculation. The construction methods themselves raise questions about the body of knowledge possessed by the Siberian peoples, both indigenous and settler, who built them. Creating a structure that could maintain stable temperature, prevent water infiltration, resist the tremendous forces exerted by freezing and thawing ground, and last for decades or even centuries required a sophisticated understanding of materials, thermodynamics, and structural engineering. This knowledge wasn't written down, wasn't preserved in technical manuals or architectural drawings. It existed in practice, in wisdom accumulated through generations of intimate observation and understanding of the environment. The cold wells represent a kind of lath, vernacular genius, a survival solution born of direct confrontation with the specific challenges of a Siberian winter. Consider the problem of the joinery. Each log had to fit precisely against its neighbor while allowing for expansion and contraction as temperatures fluctuated seasonally. Modern attempts to replicate cold well construction undertaken by experimental archaeologists reveal just how ingenious the original builders were. Initial attempts failed, wells flooded, walls collapsed, temperatures proved unstable. It took multiple iterations, careful attention to details like log selection and joinery, to create a well that functioned, even remotely, like the ancient samples. One team spent 3 summers trying to build a functional cold well using period-appropriate tools and techniques, and while they eventually created a structure that stayed frozen through the summer, they admitted their well lacked the elegance and efficiency of the originals. The mystery deepened with the discovery that not all cold wells were from the same period. Radiographic dating of various organic materials found in different wells suggested a construction span at least 2 centuries, possibly longer. Some wells appeared to date from the 18th century, others from the 19th, a few possibly older, though dating beyond a certain point becomes less precise. The earliest reliably dated well, near the Viting River, with construction techniques suggesting around 1740, though the margin of error on such dates remains wide. This raised the possibility that cold well construction was a sustained tradition over time, a body of knowledge passed down and adapted to local conditions. Others did not. Certain areas show concentrations of cold wells, while vast stretches of none at all. The distribution pattern suggests the practice emerged in specific locations as spread along certain routes, perhaps following migration paths or trade networks. There are hints, frustratingly incomplete, that cold wells might be connected to indigenous knowledge systems predating Russian settlement. Some of the oldest wells show slightly different construction techniques from later samples, different wood choices, different joinery patterns, different ways of handling the interface between frozen and non-miners frozen ground. Indigenous peoples have lived in these landscapes for millennia before Russian settlers arrived. They developed their own complex methods of food preservation and storage adapted to local conditions and available materials. It is not unreasonable to propose that settlers learned from indigenous practices, adopting and adapting techniques that already existed. Historical accounts from early Russian explorers and settlers occasionally mention learning survival techniques from native peoples, though these accounts are often vague and filtered through cultural prejudice, making it hard to extract precise technical information. But the evidence is circumstantial, and the indigenous peoples who might confirm or explain these connections had, by the time archaeologists began asking questions, largely been displaced or assimilated. Oral traditions were broken, knowledge systems fragmented. What remained were the structures underground and the incomplete stories, unable to be connected into a coherent narrative. Researchers attempted to collaborate with indigenous groups, like the Evenki and the Saka, gathering information on traditional storage practices. But by the late 20th century, most communities have been using modern refrigeration for generations, and knowledge of older techniques had faded. A cold well discovered near the Alden River in 1995 contained something unexpected, a small wooden box, carefully nailed, buried in the frozen soil at the very bottom of the shaft. The box had been sealed with resin, and inside, preserved in the eternal cold, were seeds. Dozens of different varieties of seeds, carefully separated and wrapped in bits of birch bark. The seeds were identified as vegetables and grains once cultivated in Siberia: turnips, cabbages, peas, barley, rye. But some were varieties no longer in cultivation, genetic lines lost to time and changing agricultural practices. This discovery suggested the cold wells served in part as seed banks, a way of preserving genetic diversity against crop failure or other disasters. Agronomists examining the seeds noted that some varieties showed adaptations to extremely short growing seasons and low temperatures, traits that have been bred out of modern cultivars in favor of higher yields under more controlled conditions. This discovery shifted some researchers' thinking about the well's function. Perhaps they were not primarily about food storage, or at least not exclusively about immediate survival. Perhaps they represented a longer-term strategy, a way of ensuring that even if a settlement was destroyed or abandoned, knowledge and resources would endure, frozen in the ground, waiting to be recovered. The seed cache suggested a level of planning that looked beyond the immediate winter, thinking in terms of multi-generational survival strategy. The idea resonated with patterns observed in other circumpolar, where harsh environments lead to sophisticated strategies for preserving knowledge and resources across generations. The cold wells might be Siberia's equivalent, an archive embedded in the permafrost, insurance against the ultimate disaster that periodically sweeps through human communities on these marginal lands. But as with so much about the cold wells, this interpretation remains speculative. The cold wells keep their secrets well, offering enough information to suggest fascinating possibilities while refusing to yield definitive answers. Each new discovery adds pieces to the puzzle but never completely completes the picture. Researchers develop theories, test hypotheses against the physical evidence, and find that the cold wells support multiple interpretations without decisively confirming anyone. Modern climate change adds urgency to the study of cold wells. As permafrost melts across Siberia, structures that have remained frozen and stable for centuries are beginning to deteriorate. Wells that survived generations are now collapsing as the ground around them loses its frozen solidity. Organic materials preserved in the permafrost are beginning to rot, their informational content lost with time. Archaeologists race to document cold wells before they disappear, but resources are limited, and Siberia is vast. For every well that is properly excavated and studied, dozens or hundreds remain undiscovered, slowly collapsing back into the earth that preserved them. The knowledge they contained about construction techniques, food preservation strategies, how people survived in the harshest of environments disappearing. Funding for such research is difficult to secure, and the logistical challenges of working in remote Siberian sites make comprehensive surveys nearly impossible. Sometimes walking deep in the tundra far from any settlement, you might notice a slight depression in the ground, a circular area where the trees grow slightly differently, where the vegetation shows a pattern not quite matching the surroundings. These subtle signs might mark the location of the cold well whose wooden lining is long since rotted away, whose carefully stored contents were consumed or decayed, but whose presence still leaves an imprint on the landscape for those who know how to read such signs. Indigenous people still living in these regions, descendants of both Siberian natives and Russian settlers, speak of knowing where old storage sites are. But when pressed for details, for exact locations or specific knowledge, the information often becomes vague. Perhaps the knowledge truly is lost. Perhaps it is being protected, kept within communities, not shared with outsiders and archaeologists. There is something fitting in that some knowledge remaining uncoverable, some mysteries persisting not because they cannot be solved, but because the people who hold the answers choose not to share them, or because the system for passing knowledge was broken before the transfer was complete. In this light, the cold wells stand as heirs, monuments to the fragility of cultural knowledge, testaments to how easily complex understanding can vanish when the context that sustains it is destroyed. And so, The cold wells remain as partial mysteries. We know they existed, have a rough idea of how they were built, can make educated guesses about what they contained and how they were used. But the full story, the cultural significance, the social organization that maintained them, the specific practices surrounding their use remains partly hidden, frozen in the past, just as the food was once frozen in their depths. Each well excavated adds fragments of information, but the complete picture continues to elude researchers. Perhaps it is fitting for structures designed to preserve things across time. They have, after all, preserved themselves, if not completely, then enough to remind us that human ingenuity takes many forms, that solutions to fundamental problems like winter survival emerge in ways we are still struggling to fully understand, that the people who lived in these harsh landscapes possessed a knowledge we are only beginning to appreciate. The technical sophistication becomes more apparent on closer examination. Consider the problem of thermal management. Maintaining a consistent freezing temperature through the summer requires understanding how cold penetrates and persists in soil, how different materials conduct or insulate, how their circulation affects temperature stability. The builders somehow knew that deeper was better, that certain depths remained frozen regardless of surface conditions. They knew which wood resisted rot under constant damp, which joinery patterns could flex without failing as the ground moved, which orientations and locations provided natural advantages for maintaining low temperatures. Some wells are located near streams or rivers, some on slightly higher ground, others in dense forest where shade kept ground temperatures lower. The siting was not random. Each location shows evidence of deliberate choice based on criteria that aligned with the well's intended function. Researchers mapping well locations noted patterns suggesting an understanding of microclimates, of how landforms affect ground temperature and moisture. It was a sophisticated environmental knowledge that could only have emerged through sustained observation and experimentation. There are accounts, fragmentary and hard to verify, of people making regular inspections of the wells in winter and spring, descending into the shafts to assess conditions and retrieve small amounts of stored food. A story recorded from an old man in a settlement near Kuznetski in the early 20th century describes his grandfather lowering a candle into the well before descending. If the candle went out, the air at the bottom might be bad, and he would wait before entering. This suggests awareness of gas buildup in confined spaces, another piece of practical knowledge, indicating a level of understanding. Even decomposing organic materials can produce gases that displace oxygen, creating dangerous conditions in a confined space. The candle served as both thermometer and atmospheric tester, its flame indicating temperature and oxygen availability. The practice was unique to Siberian miners, and well miners diggers around the world have used similar techniques, but its application to cold well management shows a wisdom in integrating different kinds of knowledge into a coherent practice. The social dimensions of cold well use remain largely obscure yet endlessly fascinating. If the wells were indeed communal resources, how was access determined and enforced? Who decided when an emergency justified opening the well? How were contributions tracked and extractions monitored? Some researchers posit the wells operated within a gift economy framework common in many northern cultures, where contributions and reciprocity are governed by social obligation rather than formal accounting. Others propose a more structured system, perhaps with designated custodians responsible for maintenance and access control. A few wells show evidence at the top of having had locks or security devices, suggesting concern over unauthorized access. One well near it cuts cut metal fittings that seem to have held a substantial lock, though the lock itself was long gone. This implies the resource was valuable enough to protect, or that trust alone was sufficient to rely on social norms, or both. That some wells have security features and others do not may reflect differences in social organization, resource scarcity, or historical period. The question of how long food remained edible in a cold well has practical implications for understanding its function. Modern food science suggests that properly frozen food can retain nutrition for years, though quantity gradually declines. But the wells were not modern freezers with controlled temperatures and sealed containers. They were complex natural systems where temperatures fluctuated seasonally, humidity levels varied, and the food itself was in direct contact with soil and other organic materials. Experimental work shows that fish and meat, if frozen quickly and stored at consistently sub-0 temperatures, can remain edible for years. Seeds, particularly if kept dry and very cold, can remain viable for decades. Fats and oils are more problematic, turning rancid even if frozen if exposed to air or fluctuating temperatures. Yet the reindeer fat found in the Kolyma well seemed to have been preserved for a considerable time, suggesting storage techniques that minimize degradation. Perhaps the fat had been sealed in containers, or perhaps the permafrost's environment provided preservation conditions that controlled experiments cannot replicate. The chemical analysis that identified the fat as reindeer also detected compounds that might have been preserved as birch or as spruce resin, substances known for their anti-unbreakable properties. This raises the possibility that food was treated before being placed in the well, that preservation is a multi-stage process combining chemical treatment, proper packaging, and optimal storage conditions. If so, the knowledge required went beyond well construction to include an understanding of natural preservatives, optimal processing methods, and proper handling of food intended for long-term storage. The seed cache found near the Alden River hints at another layer of preservation knowledge. Seeds require specific conditions to remain viable: proper moisture content, stable temperatures, protection from pests and fungi. The careful separation of different seed varieties and wrapping in birch bark suggests an understanding that different seeds have different needs, that mixing them could lead to moisture transfer or cross-contamination. The birch bark itself is an interesting choice, possessing natural anti-fungal properties and providing a degree of humidity regulation while allowing some air circulation. Botanical analysis of the seeds revealed something unexpected. Some showed signs of coming from particularly robust or high-yielding plants. They were not random samples but seeds selected from plants that exhibited desirable traits. This hints at active plant breeding, selection for characteristics suited to Siberian growing conditions: early maturation, cold tolerance, drought resistance. The cold wells were not just for preserving ordinary seeds, but for safeguarding carefully selected genetic lines, for preserving agricultural knowledge embodied in plant varieties developed through generations of selection and cultivation. The loss of these varieties is more than just a loss of diversity, it is a loss of adaptedness, of solutions bred for the specific challenge of growing food in a marginal environment. Modern agriculture, focused on industrial-scale production and standardized varieties, has little use for plants adapted to the short, cold growing seasons and poor soils of eastern Siberia. Yet as climate changes and agricultural zones shift, the traits bred into those lost varieties might prove valuable. The cold wells preserve them for the future, but the warming that now threatens the wells themselves comes too late to recover most of that plant heritage. Some researchers have begun exploring whether the principles of cold wells could be applied to modern challenges. Could structures based on cold well designs provide low-energy food storage in permafrost regions? Could the construction techniques inform building methods in areas where modern infrastructure is threatened by ground instability as permafrost melts? These questions generate interest, but practical applications have been few, partly because the specific knowledge that made cold wells work remains incompletely understood. An experimental project in Yakutia attempted to build a modern version of a cold well using traditional design principles but modern materials and tools. The structure performed reasonably well, maintaining freezing temperatures to the summer and serving as a food storage for a research station. But the builders admitted their well lacked something the originals possessed: a quantity they found difficult to define but were aware was missing. Perhaps it was the integration of the design with the landscape, the way traditional wells seemed to emerge from the environment rather than being imposed upon it. Perhaps it was simply the refinement that comes with time, with use and modification over generations. Whatever the missing element was, its absence highlighted how much has been lost, how difficult it is to reconstruct traditional knowledge, even when physical samples exist for study. The cold wells also raise questions about how we understand and value different forms of knowledge. Academic archaeology and anthropology prioritize certain kinds of evidence that which is measurable, recordable, replicable. But much of what made the cold wells successful existed in practical technique, in a no-minus how of doing, in a wisdom that was never made explicit enough to be recorded, even if a recording system had existed. This embodied knowledge leaves few traces in the archaeological record, yet it may be as important as the physical structures themselves. An experienced builder would know things impossible to capture in drawings or measurements: the sound of wood fitting just right, the feel of frozen earth ready to accept a load, the smell of the air at the bottom of a well when conditions were correct. These sensory guides to practice vanish when the practice stops, and no amount of careful excavation can recover them. They must be relearned through experience, through making mistakes and adjusting techniques, through developing a sensitivity that only comes with repeated exposure to materials and environment. The experimental archaeologists trying to replicate cold wells discovered this. They could measure dimensions and analyze joinery, but learning to build required doing, failing, trying again until hand, eye, and intuition coordinated. In this way, the cold wells serve as reminders of the limitations of purely analytical approaches to understanding past practices. We can document what remains, can analyze, measure, and date. That we cannot fully know what it meant to build and maintain these structures, to be part of a community that depended on them, to possess the embodied knowledge that made them work. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand. The effort yields valuable insights, even if full understanding remains elusive. But it suggests we need humility in recognizing what archaeology and historical study can recover, the silences in the record that no amount of careful research can fully overcome. In recent years, some Siberian communities have shown interest in cold wells as cultural heritage, as a link to historical practices and identity. This interest sometimes conflicts with archaeological priorities. Communities may wish to use or modify wells in ways that compromise their research value, while researchers want to preserve wells as scientific resources. Negotiating these different values and interests requires recognizing that cold wells mean different things to different people, that their significance is not just historical or scientific, but also cultural and identity-based. For descendants of the people who built and used the wells, they represent a continuity with ancestors, a tangible link to ways of life that otherwise seem completely vanished. For indigenous communities, cold wells in particular can be powerful symbols of pre-and contact knowledge, proof that ancestors possessed technological skill and environmental understanding worthy of respect. This symbolic value exists independently of whether a specific community actually built or used cold wells. The structures stand as representatives of a broader northern indigenous knowledge and adaptation. Some communities have begun incorporating cold wells into cultural education programs, teaching traditional practices to young people as part of maintaining cultural identity. These programs face challenges: most communities no longer have functioning wells to learn from, and replicating authentic construction requires skills and knowledge few still possess. But the effort itself has value, creating opportunities for elders to share what they remember or word old, allowing the community to engage with its history in a tangible way, fostering in the younger generations an appreciation for ancestral ingenuity. Whether these programs successfully transmit technical knowledge is less important than their role in maintaining cultural continuity and pride. Ultimately, the cold wells offer no simple lessons or clear conclusions. They resist easy explanation, their complexity reflecting the complexity of the people and societies that created them. They remind us that human adaptation to challenging environments takes innumerable forms, that survival strategies emerge from specific contexts and cannot be generalized or transplanted without losing something essential. They show that people living on the edges of environmental possibility develop sophisticated knowledge worthy of recognition and study, even if that knowledge comes to us in fragments incompletely. They also remind us of what is lost when the connection between people and land is broken, when knowledge systems are interrupted, when practices cease, understanding fades. The cold wells survived for generations because the knowledge and practice passed from builders to users to new builders in a continuous chain of learning and teaching. When those chains break, the wells remain, but their meaning changes from living reality to archaeological puzzle, from practical infrastructure to mysterious artifact. The wells themselves haven't changed, but our relationship to them has, marking a distance and a loss that no amount of research can fully bridge. Yet something persists beyond the loss, the structures themselves, testaments to what was possible, to what people achieved in a demanding environment. Walking in the Taga, and coming across a subtle depression marking where a well once stood, there is a moment of connection across time. Generations ago someone stood here, looked at this landscape, decided this was the right spot. Someone dug into the permafrost, shaped logs to fit, built something meant to last and to serve. The people are gone, much of what they knew is gone. That the place remembers. The forest grows slightly differently here. The ground subsides in a particular way. For those who know how to see it, the well is still visible in the landscape it once served. While frontier families counted potatoes or rationed flour, another world existed in parallel. A world of stone minus walled larderies, of servants tasked with monitoring preserves, of imported luxuries and winter feasts that seemed to mock the scarcity endured by those who actually worked the land. The gulf between the Siberian peasant and the noble was as stark as the difference between winter and summer. It manifested most clearly in how each class approached the fundamental challenge of the cold months. In the larger settlements and administrative centers scattered across Siberia, places like Kuznetsk, Tobolsk, Yakutsk, government officials and wealthy merchants inhabited a completely different reality. Their homes, built of stone or thick timber with proper foundations on multiple rooms, included dedicated storage spaces designed by architects rather than improvised by desperate farmers. These cellars were feats of engineering with stone walls, proper ventilation, drainage to prevent the flooding that plagued peasant storage pits. The cellar beneath a wealthy merchant's home in Irkutsk might extend under the entire house, divided into separate rooms for different types of storage, one for root vegetables, kept at a precise temperature through carefully managed airflow, another for cured meats, cool but not freezing, with hams and sausages hanging from beams in the ceiling like strange fruit of food. The coldest, essentially a natural icebox where the permafrost beneath provided a constant, year-round temperature just below freezing. Servants, usually serfs attached to the household, maintained these cellars with the same attention a peasant applied to their family's year-long food supply. Temperature was monitored not by touch and instinct as the peasant did, but with actual thermometers imported from European Russia. Humidity levels were managed with trays of sand that could be moistened or dried as needed. Any sign of spillage was dealt with immediately, the affected items removed before contamination could spread. The quantities of food stored by elite families went beyond the arithmetic of pure survival. Where a peasant family storing 200 pounds of potatoes might consider themselves well-supplied, a merchant family would store 2,000 pounds, 10 times the amount for perhaps only twice the people. That this was just about feeding the household, it was about maintaining status, about being able to host dinners and entertain guests, about demonstrating prosperity through abundance. Winter entertainment among the Siberian elite followed rituals imported from European Russian, adapted to local conditions. When guests arrived at a merchant's home in January, they were greeted by a warmth that seemed miraculous. Multiple stoves kept constantly burning, rooms heated to temperatures that felt tropical compared to the bitter cold outside. The contrast itself was a display, proof the master had resources sufficient to defy winter. The meals served at such gatherings bore little resemblance to what the peasant ate. Yes, there were the same basic ingredients: potatoes, cabbage, beets, but prepared with imported spices, butter and cream, with attention to presentation that elevated the food to something approaching art. Salted fish appeared not as emergency rations but as delicacies. Sturgeon from the rivers served with lemons brought at great cost from the south, or smoked toenu arranged artfully on porcelain plates. Meat featured prominently in the elite winter diet in a way the peasant could never match. Where a frontier family might have a few pounds of smoked moose meat to last months, a wealthy family would have an entire room dedicated to meat storage: beef, pork, venison, bear, various fowl, all preserved through smoking, salting, or simply stored raw in the coldest larder. A single dinner might consume more meat than a peasant family saw all winter. But perhaps the most striking difference was in the luxuries that had nothing to do with basic nutrition. Sugar imported from the distant south, its cost would have bankrupted a peasant family, appeared in desserts and sweetened tea. Tea itself, real Chinese tea, not the herbal substitutes peasants brewed, was consumed daily, multiple times a day, in quantities that suggested an inexhaustible supply. Dried fruits from warmer climates, apricots, figs, raisins provided flavors and textures completely unavailable to those living on the frontier. Vodka, that quintessential Russian spirit, existed in fundamentally different forms by class. The peasant drank a rough spirit, distilled from whatever grain they could spare, the kind that burned the throat and left a headache the next morning. Elite families served vodka, infused with berries, honey, herbs, and spices, served in glass bottles rather than clay jugs, poured into small crystal glasses rather than wooden cups. The social rituals surrounding food storage and distribution were entirely different as well. Where a peasant community might gather to discuss communal storage strategies, elite households operated through hierarchies of servants and detailed record-keeping. The steward kept written inventories of everything stored, according dates of preservation, location within the cellar, expected shelf life. These records were reviewed regularly, and decisions about use and distribution were made according to a system that valued order and documentation. Some elite families employed specialists whose entire job was managing food preservation and storage. These were not, as in a peasant household, the women working alongside their daughters, but paid professionals, usually men who had learned the craft through apprenticeship and took pride in their expertise. They knew the optimal temperature for storing caviar, the precise salt concentration needed for different kinds of fish, the proper aging time for various cured meats. The government maintained its own storage systems, warehouses and granaries that operated on a scale completely unlike household cellars. In the larger towns, wooden structures the size of small chapels held grain reserves intended to prevent famine in case of crop failure. These state granaries were guarded by soldiers, their contents recorded in ledgers kept by bureaucrats, their distribution governed by regulations issued from distant St. Petersburg. The existence of these state reserves created a complex relationship between government and people. In theory, the reserves were there to protect everyone, to ensure that even catastrophic crop failure wouldn't lead to mass starvation. In practice, access to state stores required navigating officials who could be corrupt, who might prioritize certain groups over others, who might delay distribution until desperation became acute. The peasants knew these warehouses existed, knew that somewhere in the regional capital, grain was stored in vast quantities, while they rationed their last sacks of flour. This knowledge bred resentment, but also a bitter acceptance. The world was divided between those who controlled resources and those who barely scraped by. Winter just made the division more apparent, more impossible to ignore. Government officials posted to Siberia, administrators, military officers, judges received allowances designed to compensate for the hardship of frontier service. These allowances included food rations far beyond what they could possibly consume. The surplus provided opportunities for profitable trade, or simply for wasteful abundance. An official might receive a monthly allocation of grain, meat, butter, and tea sufficient for a family of 10 or 12, even if he lived alone or only with his wife. Some officials used this surplus generously, distributing the excess to those in need, providing meals for subordinates and visitors, essentially serving as an informal welfare source for the community they governed. Others hoarded, selling their allocations at inflated prices, or letting food rot rather than share with those they considered beneath them. The quality of winter survival in some communities depended heavily on the character of the officials stationed there. Tensions between the classes rarely erupted into open conflict. The harshness of the Siberian environment created a common understanding that survival required at least a minimum of cooperation. But the tensions were there, evident in the careful way peasants spoke to their social superiors, and the rumors that circulated about official corruption, in the quiet satisfaction peasants felt when an elite family suffered some setback or loss.